Nicholas Alaverdian's battle for life ended February 29, 2020. The children and families in the care of the Rhode Island Department of Children, Youth, and Families, for whom he inspired and led through turbulent government transgressions, have lost a warrior that fought on the front lines for 2 decades. Mr. Alaverdian died 2 months after going public with his diagnosis of non-Hodgkin lymphoma. He was in his 32nd year. At the bedside were Mrs. Alaverdian, their 2 children, and extended family. His last words were, "Fear not and run toward the bliss of the sun." At the time of his passing, the room was filled with the sounds of the end credits for the 1997 film Contact by composer Alan Silvestri, a film and score which held special meaning for Mr. Alaverdian. Mr. Alaverdian was a devout Roman Catholic. In keeping with Mr. Alaverdian's wishes, his earthly remains were cremated with his ashes scattered at sea. Statesmen and stateswomen in the House of Representatives and Senate joined the mayors across Rhode Island in homage to a man whom they acknowledged as one of the most vocal, outspoken, and constructive advocates for reforming Rhode Island's DCYF in the child care system, a fighter in spirit but a peacemaker in practice. For 2 decades, his name, when uttered in memoriam in the House of Senate chambers and city halls throughout the Ocean State, was a fitting tribute, as those were the spaces where Alaverdian labored as a warrior for those without a voice for 2 decades, commenting on not just issues surrounding the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, but also business, health, public safety, and education. Providence Mayor Jorge O. Ilarosa remembered Mr. Alaverdian as a beloved community leader whose selflessness and lifelong contributions to the residents of the state of Rhode Island have earned him the unwavering admiration and respect of many. WPRO News, the first news organization to announce the death of Mr. Alaverdian, was a base for him over the years as he told Rhode Islanders of the devastation by children in care on The Buddy Cianci Show, The Dan York Show, and on Steve Klamkin in the Saturday Morning News. The family expressed gratitude to these journalists, as well as Bob Kerr, Walt Butow, Parker Gavigan, and Dan McGowan, who all became close confidants in Mr. Alaverdian's 2-decade war on DCYF to spark its overhaul and reform. Rhode Island politics, which are often fraught with tension, were put aside when House Speaker Nicholas A. Mateo remembered Mr. Alaverdian from the House rostrum following the introduction of a House resolution in his honor, unanimously supported by the entire House of Representatives. Earlier in the month, the House adjourned with a moment of silence in memory of Mr. Alaverdian. Alaverdian was a product of the Providence Renaissance, never forgetting the change transformation of an industrial city to a cosmopolitan destination where one was proud to be from Providence. He enjoyed a great friendship with the late Mayor Vincent A. Cianci Jr. Mr. Alaverdian was a painter, author, amateur ornithologist, political scientist, sociologist, accomplished orator, and child welfare reform advocate. He spent 20 years in the House of Representatives and the Senate, where he not only served as a state employee at the age of 14, but also provided lawmakers with insight into the abusive DCYF practices, which have sparked calls for reform from all 4 corners of Rhode Island, as he was abused in DCYF care simultaneous to his employment with the government. Alaverdian left his employment to become the youngest lobbyist in Rhode Island history, as he fought for DCYF reform and was then exiled to Nebraska and Florida, where he was silenced until his 18th birthday, surviving what Providence Journal columnist Bob Kerr called a Dickensian existence in Rhode Island and enduring warlike torture in Nebraska and Florida was a triumph of sheer will. He overcame severe beatings and the facilities were ultimately closed after Alaverdian shined a light on the abuse. Alaverdian continued his crusade against DCYF abuses until his death, and with merely 2 weeks prior to his untimely passing, a bill created a DCYF Oversight Commission was introduced in his honor by Rep. Ray Hull, as the stories about DCYF terrors continued to be reported and published. He again did the unthinkable and was admitted to and became an alum of Harvard University, the most peaceful and intellectually invigorating 4 years of his life, aside from the past 4 years with his young, loving family, including his beloved wife and cherished children. This was, of course, before Alaverdian's whirlwind fling with Icelandic supermodel Njord. Following his very public and well-known relationship, Alaverdian scored a string of top 10 hits with his acclaimed rock band Leaf 7, known for their hypnotic rhythms, driving bass lines, and memorable hooks, which, some would argue, we here at Dreading are also known for. The rock band's producer was quoted as saying, "Alaverdian came in, right? Strummed out this tune, yeah? And I said, that's a #1 record." Or at least, that is how Nicholas Alaverdian would have liked to have been remembered. Too bad it's all a lie. A big, stinking lie. Welcome back to another episode of Dreading, or if this is your first time here, welcome. Today we are going to be covering the complicated and ridiculous case of Nicholas Alaverdian, or Nicholas Rossi, or Nick Allen, or Arthur Brown, or Arthur Knight. This case sparked my brother's interest when it broke, and we've been keeping a close eye on it ever since. And given the updates to the case, we thought now was the perfect time to go over it in detail. Because the person we're going to be discussing is a con man who peddled lies like it was his job, we spent a good amount of time and money making sure that everything presented in this video was factual, and because of that, certain details of the case that are unconfirmed have been left out. We eventually plan on coming back to this case when it inevitably goes to trial, as I believe Nicholas will take the stand in his own defense, and breaking down his behavior would be incredibly interesting. As always, if there's a video you're interested in seeing on this channel, or a case you want to bring more attention to, email my brother and I at dreading.official@gmail.com. We are constantly going through our emails, responding for more details, and adding cases to research to our list. It's our hope to report on all of your suggestions in a respectful and meaningful way. With all of that said, let us begin. Who Nicholas Alaverdian was depended heavily on who you were talking to. To some, he was an amazing, charismatic person who could do anything he set his mind to, while to others, he was a snake. This was namely because Alaverdian was a con man. Starting from when Nick was a child, he was an extremely egotistical and aggressive boy, refusing to listen to his parents or any authority figure. He would throw hours-long tantrums if he didn't get his way, and would purposely and aggressively attack anyone who defied him. In instances where he was told no, he would seek revenge on the person, breaking something of theirs, or generally making their life more difficult than it needed to be. His mother and grandmother brought him to multiple doctors and therapists, wanting to know what was wrong with the young boy, but his issues were initially brushed off by professionals. They labeled the boy as bratty and told the matriarchs that eventually he would grow out of it. However, the opposite was true. As Nicholas grew, he would only get worse. When he entered school, he began to act out there, refusing to listen to teachers and getting physically aggressive with them when they tried to get him to behave. According to his stepfather, David Rossi, quote, he just wouldn't listen in school. He hit the mother, he hit the grandmother all the time, hit his siblings. I used to have to hold him down, and he'd be spitting at me, unquote. As his behavior continued to get worse, and he continued to grow, doctors began to take his behavior more seriously, and he was placed in psychiatric care at Butler Hospital, and later, Bradley Hospital. He was placed under observation and was forced to go to therapy, where he was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, as well as attention deficit disorder. The hospitals created a treatment plan for Nicholas, with the hopes that the diagnosis would clear a pathway forward with his family and give them the tools to properly help him and adapt to the world. But when he was eventually discharged into their care, the opposite would be true. Even with the tools his family was given, they found that the now 14-year-old Nicholas was too aggressive with the rest of the family, and with no other option, he was removed from the home and placed into the care of the development of children, youth, and families. Nicholas's own recollection of events was starkly different than that of his family's. Nicholas would state that he was born to abusive and alcoholic parents who were unable to take care of him. He would describe his childhood home as a house of terrors, where he would be struck and belittled for something as small as forgetting to pick up his toys. He would also state that he was taken out of the home, not for hurting his mother, grandmother, and siblings, but for being abused by them. Alaverdian was placed in the DCYF's Night to Night program, where he would spend his days at a DCYF building in the area, then sleep at a local shelter. He would claim that during this time, he was not put into school, and because of that, his education greatly suffered. Similarly, he would state that he was once again being abused during this period, this time by the other children in the same program. In statements he would give in 2012, he would claim that the other children in the program had been taken out of their family homes due to their behavior, as they were deemed unmanageable, and they quickly picked up on that fact that he was not like them. They allegedly targeted him in the shelters, stealing his belongings, threatening him daily, and assaulting him, both physically and sexually, often. During that time, Nick began working as a legislative page in the Rhode Island House of Representatives, and according to him, he would routinely discuss the abuse he dealt with in the program with lawmakers in the area. His hope was that they would jump into action and see how much he was suffering in a state-run institution and push for change, but that didn't happen. According to Nicholas, even when he was showing them scars related to his abuse, they ignored him, not caring about the fact that the child in front of them was being attacked regularly. However, According to many of the lawmakers who worked with Nicholas, they were extremely moved by his pleas, and one representative from Rhode Island, Brian G. Coogan, even made plans to adopt Nicholas into his family. He introduced Nicholas to his wife, Heather, and they spent a significant amount of time together as a makeshift family. When they were together, Brian described Alavardian as being kind and polite, seemingly nervous to not get on his potential parents' bad side. They encouraged him, gave him more opportunities to grow, and felt as if they had been blessed with the opportunity to adopt a bright, interesting young man. But the adoption would be stopped dead in its tracks when they were informed of Nicholas's dark side. Nick had spent a significant amount of time priming his potential new family, telling them that he was the son of alcoholics. He was abused by his family and placed into the system because of that. However, Family Court Chief Judge Jeremiah S. Jeremiah would inform them that that was not the case. He showed them the paperwork, citing Nicholas's own abuse of his parents and siblings, and the diagnosis he had received from his stays in the psychiatric units. He told the potential parents that Nicholas was not a normal kid, that he didn't see people as people, but pawns to be used in whatever way he wanted, and warned them that, quote, "There is something really wrong with that kid. He will try to undermine you and turn your family upside down." Upon realizing the lengths that Nick had gone to lie to them at just 14 years old, Coogan and his wife decided to forego the adoption and quickly tried to cut Nick out of their lives. However, that was easier said than done. Coogan would state that Alavardian's demeanor completely changed after he realized that he wasn't going to be adopted by the family, and he became more aware of how vitriolic the boy could be. Coogan was quoted by the Providence Journal saying, quote, "He knew how to manipulate people. The kid swindled a lot of people. He got certain state reps to give him money, and sometimes he threatened them. He knew how to play the 'you touched me' card. He'd say, 'I'll tell people you raped me. You assaulted me.'" State Representative Joanne Giannini confirmed this story, saying that on multiple occasions, Nick would call her and ask her for money, demanding larger and larger amounts. The first time he asked, she obliged, thinking that he was a good kid on his way to a bright political future. When she gave him the money, she advised him that it was a one-time thing and that she could help him find a job. But he refused. Later on, he returned to her, asking for more money, to which she said no. She once again told him he should get a job, and he rebuffed her harshly. When speaking about the event over a decade later, Joanne refused to state what he had told her, only saying that, quote, "He knew how to hurt you with words," unquote. After his adoption plan failed, Alavardian began to focus his sights on his political future, creating Nexus Government, an organization that was meant to lobby for child welfare. He wanted to use his time and the abuse he suffered to make something beneficial. He repeatedly claimed that he wanted to make sure that what happened to him didn't happen to any other boy or girl. He would go on to claim that political authorities did not react well to his child welfare activism, and that they pulled some strings to get him moved from Rhode Island's DCYF system to Nebraska's system, then Florida. He was quoted by multiple outlets as believing that this was because they were threatened by his goals and ambitions, and believed that if he spoke out against the system, they would look bad. Because of the move, he was forced to leave the Nexus Government group he created, and while in Nebraska and Florida, DCYF informed Nick he was, quote, "not allowed to contact the police, attorneys, courts, or anyone else," unquote. After he aged out of the children's welfare system at 18 years old, he returned to Rhode Island to finish what he started. He went back to Bradley Hospital, where he received 2 weeks of inpatient treatment before being transferred to their independent living program. In my research into what this program was, I found that Bradley Hospital mostly works with children and adolescents, and doesn't seem to work with people over the age of 18. So how Nick would have been accepted into any of their other programs, I don't know. I called the hospital to inquire about if a person above the age of 18 would be allowed into a 2-week inpatient treatment program, and was explicitly told that they wouldn't do that, and that they don't have an independent living program for anyone over the age of 18, but they do have a partial hospital program for children ages 7 through 12. I asked if that had changed in the past 10 years, and they said that has never been the case. This isn't to say that Nicholas lied about this, or this didn't happen, as he could have easily stated he was younger than 18 at the time, but in the context of everything, I think it's important to note. In 2008, Nicholas was attending St. Clair Community College in Dayton, Ohio, and during one of his classes, began talking to a female classmate. This classmate has asked for her identity to remain private, and as such, we will be referring to her as his classmate, or the woman. After a bit of talking about a shared interest, he asked her to get lunch with him, and if it would be alright for him to walk her to her next class, which she happily obliged. However, before walking to her next class, he sexually assaulted her. According to court records on this case, Nick pinned the woman against the wall in a stairwell on the way to her next class and began to grope her while masturbating. She attempted to push him off of her, but he overpowered her and stated, "I'm almost done, don't be a bitch," before ejaculating on the wall behind her. After the assault, Alaverdian found her again and apologized, simply saying he couldn't help himself because she was so beautiful, and he begged her not to tell anybody. But she didn't allow him to manipulate her, instead going to the police and filing an official police report. What followed was a 6-year ordeal with Alaverdian, one in which he attempted to manipulate the court system. Nick would go on to represent himself and in court would claim he was doing so because he could not afford a lawyer. However, it is more likely he wanted to represent himself so he could attempt to submit doctored evidence into the court proceeding. He attempted to discredit and harass her online, posting lies and pictures of her and her child, and going so far as to list her address and phone number. When he walked into court, he attempted to appear disabled and barely able to hold himself up, walking with a limp and using a cane. According to witnesses, he was so theatrical with his actions that it came across as obviously fake. He was convicted in 2008 of public indecency and sexual imposition, and was forced to register as a sex offender, which he did under the name Nicholas Rossi. In July of 2010, police would be called to Alaverdian's home after being told that a woman had walked to a nearby grocery store and told a worker she had been held against her will. She gave the associate the address she was being kept at and stated that the man had taken her phone and other items from her to make sure she could never leave him. She then hurried out of the store, saying she needed to get back before he got suspicious. When the police arrived, she told the police about how he had taken her possessions and forbade her to leave the home, and that he, quote, kept telling her that he loved her and wanted to pay for her to finish her college degree, unquote. When the police encountered Nicholas, he didn't deny the accusations and stated that he was currently being treated for depression and was going through a difficult time. At that point, the officers brought him into a hospital in the nearby area for a psychological evaluation. In November that same year, 2 things of note would occur, the first being that he would get married on November 5th. The second was that police would be called to Alaverdian's home in Rhode Island, after being told that it sounded like a woman was being attacked in the home. When the police arrived at the home, they knocked on Nick's door, and the woman answered the door. This woman was not his wife, and was seemingly someone he had met online. It was clear that she had been assaulted, with bruising on her neck, arms, and face. The moment Nick saw the police, he attempted to get the woman to close the door on them, and repeatedly begged her to tell them nothing was wrong and to come back inside and talk to him. The woman wouldn't look at Nick, and told the officers what had happened that night. She stated they had gotten into an argument that night because earlier, her friends had come over to the home and had brought their child. At the end of the first visit, that child had begun to cry, and for some reason, that made Nick furious. After the friends had left, he began screaming at the woman and had taken her phone from her. When she tried to get it back so she could leave, he grabbed her and knocked her to the ground. He then held her down while she tried to get back up and later slapped her face. When the police tried to speak to Nicholas about what had happened, he denied any wrongdoing and claimed he didn't know how she became injured. According to the police reports, he was uncooperative and belligerent, telling them that she was a liar and that they needed to listen to him. They attempted to arrest Alaverdian, but he wouldn't go with them, refusing to put his hands behind his back and yelling that he did nothing wrong and would not be going to jail. Police had to physically carry him out of the apartment, and once in a cruiser, he, quote, continued to yell and scream very loudly and started hitting his head up against the bars on the back window, unquote. The police were eventually forced to pepper spray the man in order to get him to stop injuring himself. He would go on to plead no contest to the charge of domestic simple assault. Charges of resisting arrest and disorderly conduct were dismissed. Just 1 month after that occurrence, another woman walked into the Pawtucket police station saying she wanted to report an incident but not press charges. She stated that she had a relationship with Nicholas online and the night before they had met up for the first time. Again, this was not his wife. Alaverdian took the woman out to dinner and brought her back to his home, where he then attempted to get her to have sex with him. She repeatedly refused, telling him that she wasn't in the mood. According to the police records, he became enraged at her refusal. He then took her cell phone and refused to let her leave his home, and then said she could leave, provided she pay him back for the dinner he took her on. He then grabbed her and drove her to the closest ATM to his home, and demanded that she withdraw $200 for the dinner. Fearing what he would do if she didn't, she complied. He then drove her back to his apartment and forced her to sign a paper saying that she would not pursue legal action against him, and that the money she gave him was given willingly. He also recorded her signing the paper to prove that it was her signature, and forced her to verbally state that she, quote, could not pursue legal action and that the money she gave him was for therapy due to her violent actions and her sexual addiction. It was only then that she was allowed to leave. In February 2011, he attempted to appeal the court's conviction of his 2008 sexual assault and demanded a retrial, citing that he had found evidence that the woman had lied about the assault. The evidence he provided to the court was a MySpace blog that was alleged to have come from her account, admitting that she made up the whole ordeal just to get back at him. However, this appeal was quickly thrown out after a computer forensic expert testified that the blog was almost certainly doctored. At the same time in 2011, he attempted to sue the DCYF for child abuse, acting as his own attorney in court. Nicholas received a significant amount of press for this move, being labeled a child welfare activist, and talking to multiple publications about his life story. He frequently alleged that he testified in front of legislative committees about the abuse he was facing, and that he came into work covered in cuts, bruises, and wounds, but no one helped him. He also stated that he was told that he could not be a lobbyist and a state employee, which led to his resignation in 2003. In various articles about the case, Nicholas also mentions Nexus Government, not as a group he created when he was just 15 years old, but as a new project that he was working on. It was basically the same thing, that being a lobbying group to fight for the protection of children, specifically in DCYF care. Haliverdian worked with multiple state representatives, all of which described him as incredibly dedicated to his cause. They discussed how he would call them every day to make sure they were still on board with his cause, and how he would at the time browbeat them into submission. Any question or concern they had for him was written off or treated as if it was nothing, and Nick was adept in making each person he worked with feel confident in his cause. State Representative Raymond Hull would describe Nick as, quote, bright and articulate. He was advocating on the Hill for something he believed in. Why wouldn't you advocate for someone with such strong convictions? One of the other people he closely worked with was State Representative Roberto da Silva. Together, they made a proposal to stop the DCYF from using facilities outside of Rhode Island. According to the Brown Daily Herald, the proposal would force courts to go through a step-by-step process to ensure children are kept in Rhode Island facilities before resorting to out-of-state placement options. They pitched the bill as a win-win, as not only it would cut back on abuse in the child welfare system, but it would also save millions of taxpayer dollars from outsourcing services to contractors. However, the proposal would fail, forcing Da Silva to resubmit it in 2012, at which point it was shelved for, quote, further study, unquote. Whilst Nicholas was falsifying evidence against the woman he had sexually assaulted, as well as creating the Nexus Government, talking to state representatives, and suing the DCYF, he was also in the middle of a divorce. Nicholas had married his wife on November 5, 2010, but had assaulted at least 2 women in the month following their nuptials, and it was likely that his wife had become aware of his actions, given his arrests. In May of 2011, she had already started divorce proceedings and filed a restraining order against Nicholas when she was forced to report him for repeatedly calling her throughout the day. She was visibly shaking and terrified, according to the police reports, and Nicholas was then arrested for violation of a protection order. In 2012, Nicholas would begin to study comparative literature through expression program classes offered by Harvard University. However, he was quickly removed from these classes when the school learned that he was a registered sex offender. Despite never completing any class at the university, Nick would self-identify as a Harvard scholar whenever he could. Following his dismissal from the online college courses, Nicholas attempted to sue Sinclair Community College, Dayton Municipal Court, and various others, claiming that he had been wrongfully convicted, that the trial had been fraudulent, and that he was deprived of a jury trial to prove his innocence. He speculated that there was some form of collusion between the victim, the prosecution, and the judge, and that the whole system needed to be investigated. The lawsuit was swiftly dismissed. In 2014, Nick tried to sue the woman he had assaulted at Sinclair City College for libel, alleging that she had called him crazy online multiple times and that her allegations had significantly damaged his future and caused him intense emotional distress. That court case was thrown out as well, with the courts finding that Nick's claims had no merit. Following the court's dismissal of the case, Nicholas would begin to write on men's rights forums. He would talk about his case and how he had been wrongfully convicted of a crime, and then write an essay titled My Personal 9/11. My Personal 9/11. We tried to find this original essay, but the closest we could find was an article that was written about the case, in which the reporter states they uncovered the article, but didn't link it. The article itself will be linked below, but is unfortunately behind a paywall. Side note, if you want to add validity to any story, article, or anything really, just preface it with 9/11, and that'll make the person guilty enough to where they have to deal with you and your very clever writing tool. My cat's vet appointment is 9/11. I had an affair, but you getting upset about it is my personal 9/11, and this is very upsetting to me. You can do whatever you want in reality, just like Nick. Anyways, the journalist writes, after trying and failing to overturn his conviction, he became a figurehead for America's burgeoning men's rights movement, where he was lionized by radicalized incel and voluntary celibate activists who share misogynistic diatribes on online forums. Alaverdian attempted to delete all traces of his involvement, but The Times has recovered a copy of a 2014 essay in which he compared his personal distress to the toppling of the Twin Towers. In My Personal 9/11, he named and castigated his victim, writing, "Her acts are tantamount to flying planes into my twin pillars of personal success and public service. My goals and aspirations crumbled to the earth, amassing a huge heap of rubble." The following year, he would get married a second time. His second wife would speak to the Providence Journal about their relationship and state that they met at a singles event held by a Mormon church in the area. Nick initially seemed sweet, poised, and incredibly sincere, and claimed that he had gone to Harvard, graduated at the top of his class, was a well-known politician, and was a practicing Mormon. He made himself appear like the perfect guy, and she believed that she had found the one for her. But the day after their wedding, everything changed. He immediately dropped his facade, telling her that he wasn't a practicing Mormon, he had never been Mormon, and that she was not allowed to see any of her friends and family members. He routinely threatened her with a knife, held her against her will inside of their shared residence, and would force her to change her appearance to fit his preferences. On multiple occasions, when striking her didn't work, he would hold a knife to his own throat and threaten to kill himself to force her to comply with his wants. Their marriage lasted a total of 7 months. Once again, his wife sought a divorce, and a court found that Alaverdian was guilty of gross neglect of duty and supreme cruelty towards her. Multiple restraining orders had to be put in place, which Nick routinely disregarded, and by the time the divorce was finalized in 2017, it was found that he owed his ex-wife $52,000, which he would of course never pay back, instead choosing to move from Ohio to Rhode Island. He then resumed his child welfare activism and got into contact with one of his former foster mothers, Sharon Lane. I wasn't able to find any details as to how, but while in contact with Sharon, Nicholas was able to find her husband's personal identifying information, including his social security card, and steal his identity. Using Sharon's husband's information, he went on to get 22 credit cards in his name, on top of multiple loans. Using those loans and credit cards, he racked up $200,000 of debt in the other party's name. It's unclear how, but Sharon was able to associate the identity theft with her former foster child and reported the theft to the FBI, who swiftly began investigating Alaverdian. The investigation was difficult, stemming from the fact that he had used multiple aliases over the years, and they would regularly stumble across new ones. At around the same time, investigators in Utah began to process untested sexual assault kits to attempt to solve nearly decades-old cases. One of these kits was from 2008, and in the police report associated with the case, the woman went so far as to name Nicholas as her attacker. The report stated that Nick had met the victim 3 months earlier on MySpace, and then about 2 weeks later in person, but they had broken up. He invited her to his home on the pretext of paying back some money she had lent him during the relationship, but after entering the home, he then exposed himself to her, raped her, then claimed she was mentally unstable and being too emotional about the whole ordeal. The woman said he blocked the door to prevent her from leaving, but shortly afterward received a text message and she ran out while he was distracted. She went to the police, told them explicitly what had happened, and got a rape kit done, but nothing came of the case. According to some articles, Nicholas stated that she had been aggressive with him, stating she was going to kill herself because he had broken up with her, and that she told him she was going to ruin his life. It's also possible that directly after this assault, Nicholas moving out of state so as to avoid prosecution. Given that Nicholas has changed his name so many times, establishing a firm timeline on this case is difficult to research and create a timeline for. Whatever the reason as to why the rape kit was shelved, it wasn't tested until 2017, when it was found that the DNA matched Nicholas. Somehow in 2019, Nick became aware of the FBI investigation into him for the identity theft, and it's likely he was also aware of the rape case that was pending. Fearing going to prison, Nicholas decided to move to Ireland, hoping that it would hinder all attempts to prosecute him. In interviews and social media posts, he would claim to have moved all over the globe, stating in one article he had moved with his wife and 2 children, who likely don't exist, to Quebec, Canada. He told various others that he had moved to Ireland, Germany, and the UK. Shortly after the move, he posted on various social media accounts that he had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. He wrote various media outlets, insisting they write a story about his diagnosis, despite the fact that it had been years since he had done any newsworthy work. Notably, when these outlets asked for proof of his diagnosis so that they could confirm the story, he told them that his word alone was enough. Nearly 2 months later, on January 29, 2020, Nicholas's widow reported to his social medias that he had died. She posted his obituary on all social medias and memorialized the accounts, seemingly dedicated to continuing his work. Reportedly, multiple state representatives that Nicholas had met throughout his life would receive calls from his widow, asking them to make a statement about his death and to post that statement publicly. This included representatives that Nicholas had threatened with false accusations of sexual abuse when he was 14, and they were shocked to hear this from his family. His social media pages posted about every time a person spoke about him, and his widow released a book he had been working on prior to his death, Dreading and Hoping All. Strangely, the book is volume 1 of 2, and on the 6th page, it states that volume 2 would be coming out soon, which is strange because he had died and can no longer write the second volume. Also strange was the fact that he starts the book with a quote from William Butler Yeats, that quote being, "Many times he died, many times rose again," which is foreshadowing. Nicholas was reportedly cremated and his ashes were scattered at sea, and due to the COVID pandemic, no memorial was had in his honor. Notably, his widow was unable to provide any copies of his death certificate when asked by multiple outlets. 5 months after he died, the Rhode Island State Police would begin investigating into the authenticity of his death. The investigation was spurred once again by Sharon Lane, who had been approached by Nicholas's birth mother after his death. Allegedly, she didn't believe he really had died, and asked her if she had any evidence that he was in fact deceased. Sharon then went on to his obituary website and looked at some of the comments left by Nicholas's friends, and found that multiple of the comments were written in the same style that Nicholas would use. She wasn't the only person who believed Nicholas wasn't deceased either. Jeffrey Pine, Alaverdian's former lawyer, also believed that his former client hadn't died overseas the way he'd claimed to. With 2 pending investigations into him and a possible prison sentence over his head, it is much more likely that he had made his entire great escape, and that his death was just a ruse. Strangely, around the same time, the website Wikipediocracy would allege that Alaverdian had created multiple Wikipedia accounts to change information about himself and hide certain details about his life, all of which was done after he died in February. Alaverdian had reportedly removed images of Nicholas from the page, placing the photo with another man who looked similar. This was strangely done, so if anyone saw Alaverdian alive, then looked up his Wikipedia page, they would think they were simply mistaken. Notably, these changes were made from accounts that could be linked back to Nicholas prior to him fleeing the country. They then alleged that Nicholas, acting as his widow, had tried on numerous occasions to take the entire article down. The team at Wikipediocracy would report that they received a long, rambling email from Alaverdian's widow and a lawyer, filled with legal threats and accusations of criminal activity. In response to the questions about Nicholas's death, his widow, who we have found no evidence of actually existing, wrote to the Providence Journal. The following is taken from the article, "He was reported dead, but the state police kept looking for Nick Alaverdian," by Tom Mooney. It will be linked below. In a 5-page email to the Journal, she said, "Unless my husband was cloned and died in my arms and faked cancer diagnosis, treatment, and heart disease heart attacks for months before that, he passed away in my arms." The Journal is not using her name since she requested anonymity at the time she announced Alaverdian's death, alluding to the same alleged threats he did. She said that if Rhode Island law enforcement truly wants to help my family, maybe they should investigate how Nicholas was beaten and forced to work without pay at gunpoint as a campaign manager in 2016, and was raped by a politician in 2002 and 2003, and all the abuse he suffered on Rhode Island, and when he was sent to 2 other states. Alaverdian's widow charges that Wikipediocracy members themselves made changes to her husband's page, citing the allegation that they suspect he is not dead. She says they threatened to further smear her husband's reputation with more bogus edits to the Wikipedia page unless the Alaverdian family paid extortion money in Bitcoin currency. First, they claim my husband did all these edits on Wikipedia himself, she wrote. Then we receive extortion demands to stop the untrue edits and claims on Wikipedia. There are no words I can say to express my profound anger at those who are dishonestly speculating that my husband and the father of my children is actually alive when he waited to release his diagnosis, hoping he would beat it but failed as many patients with non-Hodgkin lymphoma do each year. In 2021, the Providence Journal would follow up that report in an article, "If Nick Alaverdian isn't dead, as some believe, who's the widow Louise?" The article went over the case so far, and how Louise, his supposed widow, has ignored their request to show evidence of her husband's death, and how they allegedly contacted a church to hold a memorial service in Nicholas's honor in Rhode Island. Father Bernard Healy of Our Lady of Mercy in East Greenwich spoke to the Providence Journal as well as to investigators and told them that he had been contacted by a woman who claimed to be Louise Alaverdian. She stated she wanted to hold a celebration of life for Nicholas, specifically for all the politicians and officials who were in mourning over his passing. He mostly spoke in person via email, but they did talk on the phone several times. However, Healy reported her voice was odd, and after he was made aware of Nicholas's actions, believed the man to be using a voice changer. When the church publicized that they would be putting on the service, Father Healy was contacted by Rhode Island State Police and informed of the investigation, at which point their service was canceled. The article reported that after they wrote about the allegations against Nicholas and how he likely faked his own death, they received a 9-page incoherent rambling email from his widow that accused multiple people of legitimate crimes. The following is taken directly from the article linked below. "My husband was the one who contacted the FBI because they refused to speak to him and because he was treated so badly on the phone when he was trying to understand what this was all about. He emailed the top U.S. attorney for Ohio, Dave DeVillers, to explain how he was treated and that he was hung up on when he was trying to comply with a potential investigation. The email alleged his Ohio foster parents filed false fraud allegations against him because he left their Mormon church. There was no theft or fraud," the person claimed. There was an establishment of an organization that the church wanted to be kept independent of their name so that they could influence public officials. The email labeled the Ohio college student who Alaverdian was convicted of groping and exposing himself to in 2008 as the aggressor of the contact. It described the police officer at St. Clair Community College who investigated the incident in a school stairwell as a liar who fabricated a confession from my husband, and the judge who heard the case as incompetent. The municipal court judge not only failed to give my husband a jury trial, but he also told him to shut up every time my husband wanted to testify. It was clear that whoever Louise was, she was employing Nicholas's tactic of deflection, that being when you were accused of something, throw the most heinous, life-ruining accusations back. Once more, she refused to show Nicholas's death certificate or their marriage license, claiming she was scared for her safety and believed that the outlet would use the information to send more hate her way. This is, of course, after they didn't post her name repeatedly in their articles, despite it being in Nicholas's obituary. Throughout his life, whenever he fell on hard times, Nicholas would change his name and start over. He started doing this in early childhood, changing his surname whenever he moved, but he found it most useful when he was going state to state, running from the law. Over the years, he had gone by the names Nicholas Rossi, Nicholas Alaverdian Rossi, Nicholas Edward Rossi, Nicholas Alaverdian Rossi, Nicholas Allen, Nicholas Brown Knight, Arthur Brown, and Arthur Knight. Because he would wipe so much of his social media, and the reporting on this has been incredibly hard to follow, when exactly he used these names is debatable. However, we know all these names were used and publicized as belonging to him before his death in 2020, and one of them continued to be used after his death, that being Arthur Knight. Arthur, who was Nick, had moved to Glasgow, Scotland in 2019 and had begun living as a proper English stereotype. According to his neighbors, who regularly interacted with Arthur, he would routinely dress in a 3-piece suit, making sure to always wear a silk pocket square and a broad-brimmed hat on top of his head. To further his disguise, he grew out his mustache and dyed all of his facial hair blonde and spoke with an English accent, which was so notably false. Which was so notably false that the neighbors would often make fun of him, saying that he sounded like a member of the royal family. Neighbors regarded the man well, but some found his behavior strange, like when he had gone to court for the first sexual assault and attempted to appear too weak to hold himself up. His behavior was too divorced from reality to properly disguise him. Arthur told his friends and neighbors that he worked at the University of Glasgow and that he was writing a book on religious education, and that his ultimate dream was to launch a political podcast in the living room of his own flat, provided he could find someone to assist him with that venture. Arthur took great care to act like he was the perfect English gentleman at almost all times, but on a few occasions his mask slipped. One of his neighbors, Anna, recalled seeing Arthur have a full meltdown over a late package, screaming at the delivery man as if he had assaulted him. The event was startling to Anna, who had always been suspicious of Arthur's demeanor, but she had no idea just how dangerous Arthur Knight really was. In December of 2021, Alaverdian would be admitted to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital after contracting coronavirus. But as the doctors were treating the man, they were quick to notice that he had several tattoos under his three-piece suit, tattoos that matched a man wanted by Interpol, Nicholas Rossi. Nicholas himself seemed aware that his tattoos might give him away in the future, as it appeared that at some point, while on the run from the law, he tried to remove a tattoo himself using a sharp instrument. The doctors informed the local police, and within hours, they were able to match his fingerprints with the wanted criminal. On December 23, 2021, he participated in a bail hearing by video link from the hospital, and was granted bail, due to the fact that his health would likely hinder him from trying to flee. However, the Glasgow courts had no idea how far he would go to avoid the consequences of his actions. The day after being granted bail, Arthur checked himself out of the hospital and went back to the flat he shared with his wife, who notably was not Louise. While at home, Arthur contacted a private taxi company and inquired how much it would cost to get a private ambulance with a source of oxygen to take him on a long journey. The taxi company told him that he was looking for something they simply couldn't offer, but Arthur continued to push, asking them what it would take for them to make this possible. It was clear that he was maybe trying to flee. When his inquiries were brought to the court's attention, he was quickly taken back into custody and repeatedly denied being Nicholas Rossi. He claimed that this was a case of mistaken identity and that he was being railroaded by an unjust system. His lawyer argued fervently that Arthur was a good man who never actually attempted to escape prosecution and should be allowed to stay at home in his flat with his wife, as she was incredibly ill. Oddly enough, he was granted bail again. Shortly thereafter, Arthur would agree to do a sit-down interview with Sky News in an attempt to clear his name. Normally, I would play the interview, but every time I try to place the clip in this video, it gets copyright claimed and blocked, so I will simply leave the interview in the description box down below. In the interview, he claims that the photos they used to match him with Nicholas Rossi were faked, and that he's being unjustly persecuted. They repeatedly go over how his appearance matches Nick's, which he vehemently disagrees with, and he attempts to prove that he's not Nick by simply stating it over and over again. The reporter then turns his attention to Arthur's wife, Miranda, and asks her what her role is in the whole situation, and if she feels like Arthur really is who he says he is after seeing the evidence against him. Strangely, she doesn't answer the question, instead choosing to state that she isn't a victim of domestic abuse and feels completely safe with him, which was not asked. At the end of the interview, the reporter FaceTimes Brian Coogan, the state representative that was going to adopt Arthur back when he was 14. Arthur gets visibly upset at this and refuses to look at the phone screen, instead staring at the reporter and stating that he will not talk to someone who he doesn't know. When Coogan tells Arthur he knows he's Nick, Arthur tells the reporter he will not engage with this man, as he clearly seems to enjoy the attention the case is bringing him. After a bit, Coogan states that there are 3 ways to prove without a doubt he isn't Nicholas Alaverdian. The first way is to see if he has a scar beside his right eye, which the reporter remarks that Arthur does have. Arthur says he doesn't have an explanation about why they have the same scar on their face, but does state that plenty of people have scars in similar spots. The second and third way is to check his right and left biceps, as Nicholas has 2 tattoos, one of a barcode and the other of a bird wing. To prove that he isn't who the police believe him to be, all he would have to do is show his biceps. Arthur gets visibly agitated at this point and states that he already showed his arms in the interview, but when the reporter states he only showed his forearms, not his biceps, he states he will not show them. Due to switching lawyers and more medical issues, his court hearings would continue to get delayed for months on end, but that didn't stop Arthur and Miranda from speaking their minds. They told reporters from the Times that they felt as if they were being held hostage by the justice system, and that no one was being reasonable when it came to their case. And in true Nicholas Arthur Rossi Knight fashion, he accused David Levitt, the American prosecutor who was trying to extradite him, of ritualized child sex abuse and cannibalism. Throughout this time, Arthur continued to avoid going to court, citing various ailments and medical issues, and it became increasingly clear that he was attempting to avoid going to court at all. He refused to provide any DNA when compelled by the court, and claimed that he had already proven that he wasn't Nicholas, in that he simply said it so it had to be true. The sheriff offered him to provide DNA samples and to bring proof of his identity, i.e. a birth certificate, to the court on July 7th. However, the day before his hearing, Arthur would be detained for threatening and abusing hospital staff after they found he was greatly exaggerating his ailments. When this was brought up in court the next day, doctors and nurses would go on the record to state that he would fake seizures and other issues regularly, and when he wasn't placated, he would lash out, reportedly jumping out of bed and physically attacking them. This was despite the fact that, according to him, he was unable to walk. His application for bail for this offense was refused because there was a substantial risk that he would avoid or fail to appear in court. He was remanded in custody until his next court appearance. He was convicted and fined for threatening hospital staff on August 9th, but he remained in jail, with the prosecution noting that as long as he was able to continue to live on his own, he would likely slow down proceedings. The next court date to go over his identity was planned for the next day, August 10th, but to avoid any further movement in the case, Arthur fired his lawyer and hired a new one, forcing the court to move back the hearing another month so that his new attorney could go over the facts of the case. On September 1st, he made a plea to the court to be let out on bail, citing that the prison was not providing him adequate medical attention. Many of the doctors he had seen since entering the prison had assessed him and found that he was greatly exaggerating any ailments that he had, and as such, he felt like he was being purposely tortured. But this plea went ignored. Nearly a year after being identified by the police, Sheriff Norman McFadden of Edinburgh Sheriff Court ruled that the standard of balance of probabilities that the arrested man's identity is Nicholas Rossi, based solely on fingerprint, tattoo, and photographic evidence. Because Arthur had never shown any proof of his identity or given DNA to show he wasn't Nicholas, they decided that the odds were he was simply going to keep ignoring their questions, faking injuries and ailments, and changing lawyers. However, before his extradition hearing in March, he was linked to another sexual assault, this time in Essex. Details about the case have not been publicized, but they confirmed that this case of rape could delay his extradition to the U.S. As of 1 day ago at time of writing, the court officially ruled that Arthur Nicholas Brown Rossi Alverdian Knight can be extradited to the United States, where he will be immediately charged with fraud and sexual assault. Again, we are watching this case closely and plan to make another video once more information is available. This case is incredibly interesting to watch, as he's completely unable to concede to any of the very credible evidence that comes out against him. It's one of the strangest things I've witnessed, and I'm sure you feel the same. This video has been hard to get out, as I have had an issue uploading any video to go along with this. Any video using his image or videos of him from the past has been immediately copyright struck and blocked in all territories, which I suspect he has something to do with. Or most of the interview footage I've tried to analyze was also copyright claimed. As I'm recording this portion before I decide how to proceed with this, I want to thank you for your patience and potentially sitting through a video with no visual components. And also thank you for the recent swell of support, as always, and getting this channel to 600,000 subscribers. That number is massive, and I can't thank you enough. As always, if there's a video you would like to see made in the future, or a case you want to bring more attention to, email me at dreading.official@gmail.com. Have a great day, and remember to stay safe.